Hey guys, hope you're all doing okay. Welcome to the complete tutorial for Yuzu Emulator, one of the Nintendo Switch emulator which has gained so much popularity lately, and rightfully so. I've been following the release cycle since 2017. So far, up until recently, it was only capable of a single-threaded core recompiler, which resulted in a really bad performance. Another emulator, Ryujinx, which is also a Switch emulator, remained somewhat the same. As there are two competing emulators in this space, I'm gonna make a lot of comparisons between the two. I want to mention that competing emulators is quite rare to see, and it's one of the most wonderful things for the emulation community. To give you some perspective, these are the minimum and recommended settings for the emulator. I think their recommended specifications here are completely wrong. A 1650, really? It should be a GTX 1080 or RTX 2070, 2080 or RTX 30 series card recommended here, because a 1650 is a really underpowered card, in my opinion. If you want to get the best performance from Yuzu and you got the dough, you need to get Intel i9-10900K and a high-end RTX card. This will eventually change as we get more performance optimizations, so you won't need that high specifications. I have so much to say about Switch emulation, I really do, but I don't want to make this video 2 hours long. Switch architecture is Nintendo's most unique IP. Usually handheld consoles have guts that aren't really that powerful, so the emulation is comparatively easier. However, in this special case, the guts of the Switch are competently powerful, as it can render Full HD, so you can dock your Switch to a TV and then you can render it Full HD. We have two emulators for the Switch, as you know. Healthy competition is always better for consumers. In some cases, Ryujinx takes the cake, while in others, Yuzu is unbeatable. They're both trying to efficiently emulate the Switch, but their approaches to the emulation are vastly different. In my personal opinion, Ryujinx is trying to take a thorough approach, which is much more stable and future-proof, while Yuzu takes bold decisions in its emulation, even if the bugs are left in, but they are quite fast and fix discrepancies efficiently. There are two ways to download this emulator. First is to get the GitHub revision, and the second one is to get from its official website. And as this emulator is in its infant stage, we're just gonna get the stable release from the website. So let's go to yuzuemu.org, and here we are. We're gonna go to download, and then here we can download the folder. Before we get started, I actually like to mention that we need Visual C++ 2019 redistributable installed. So technically we just need 2019 installed, but it's always a good idea to have the 2010 till 2019 C++ redistributable packages x60, x86, x64, both of them installed from 2010 to 2019. So you can actually find a exe file on the internet if you just Google a redistributable C++ 2010 to 2019 all-in-one exe file. So it's always a good idea to install that, because if you have that installed, as most emulators run on C++, most software, firmware, and a lot of games, so you won't get that DLL library error, Qt error, or a C++ error. So please have that installed as a prerequisite. So after that, we're just gonna download that, and when you download that, the file is gonna be yuzuinstall.exe. It's gonna be 4 to 5 megabytes of file, and when you launch that, it's gonna download 75 megabytes worth of repositories from GitHub, which is totally fine. And after that, it's done downloading, it's just gonna install it in your app directory, so in your user and then app data, roaming, and then you're gonna have Yuzu folder there. You can also find it in the taskbar right here. So if you click it or search it here, you can find it, and then you can open the file location. After that's installed, you can launch the emulator without any hindrances. There is one more thing. We need the Switch firmware. So Switch firmware, I think it's emulator doesn't really need, but we need the validator. So we actually need the software that tells the Switch whether the game is legitimate or not. So we need the keys file. There are two keys file, and you can actually get these from your Switch. So you can dump these from your Switch into your PC. You might be thinking, why on earth would I run a emulator if I had a Switch? But just to put a disclaimer here, all of the Nintendo's intellectual property is their intellectual property, so it is illegal to run it. So unless you have a Switch, something that you own, and then you can dump it in your PC, you can't legally run it. So just to let you know, I know there are a lot of ways people can just download these keys. It's not hard to find, but this is a legal way to do it. So after you've done it, you're just gonna paste it in your app data roaming Yuzu folder, and there's gonna be a folder called keys, and then you're gonna have these two keys available in there. So you can just put these two keys in there, and after that we're ready to go. So let's launch our emulator, and here we are. For some reason, if you get an error while dumping your keys from your Switch, you can actually reinitialize them. But first I would suggest that you do a MD5 checksum on your keys to make sure that they are actually valid. So if something goes wrong in the process, you can actually reinitialize them. So it's going to delete your previous keys, and then you can assign them new keys that you've just dumped them from your Switch. Hopefully that makes sense. I will just link a full guide to the dumping the Switch keys in the description below. So let's go through the UI. First we have install file to NAND. So NAND is a storage medium, just like a hard drive or SSD or a SD card or eMMC. NAND is actually a really fast storage medium, and Switch has a NAND chip. So the emulator is gonna pretend that that directory that we have the Yuzu on. So it's going to pretend that that directory is our NAND file. So if you want to install any files to that directory, we will just select this option and it will install those files into that directory. We have load file, load folder, which is going to load our file or folder in here. And then recent files is just going to give a list of the recent files that we might have run on this emulator. Then we have load amiibo, which is a agent. It's not active now because we're not currently in game. We're just going through the UI. Open user folder, if you want to open user folder. Exit is exit. Start, pause, stop, restart, and then configure current game are pretty self-explanatory. Then I have configure, which I'm gonna go in a little bit later on. And then we have view, full screens, a single window mode, and then all these options, which are pretty self-explanatory. Debugging, we're not gonna go through that because it's only for debugging purposes. It's not really that performance related. And in tools, we have reinitialize keys. So if you want to reinitialize your keys and your previous ones are corrupted for some reason, you can just reinitialize it from here, and you can use your new keys, freshly dumped keys. And then if you have capture screenshot, which is also pretty self-explanatory, and it helps you have report compatibility if you want to report a specific issue. Open mods page, open quick start guide, FAQ, and about Yuzu, pretty self-explanatory. I have the Yuzu early access build. So if you want the early access build, please consider supporting the developer team on Patreon, and you can get these access build weeks early. And sometimes in these access builds they have some features that aren't available to public builds. So if you like what these guys are doing, please consider supporting them on Patreon. Or if you want to support Ryujinx on Patreon, that's also another option. So it really depends on what you want to go with. Or if you don't want to support these guys on Patreon, that's totally fine as well. Just download their emulator and enjoy. So let's go to emulation and go into our options. First we have general category, and in general we have these tabs, and first option we have limit speed percent, and we have it at 95%. I'm gonna disable that for now, and when I have it disabled, I might run some lightweight game, and sometimes the games can be so lightweight that their FPS can go to 900 or 1000 or 700 or 800 or something crazy like that, because our PC is so much more powerful than a Switch. So if we want to limit that speed, we can limit to 100, so it will actually limit that speed to 100 and we'll get our solid consistent FPS. It won't go overboard. But if you're running a heavy game, you don't even have to worry about that. So in some intro or some outros where there are black screens, then your FPS can just suddenly go to 700 or 800 if you don't have this feature enabled. So you can just enable it and set it to 100%. Multi-core CPU emulation, you always gonna have it enabled unless you're doing debugging. So always have it enabled. This feature has been implemented in recent user revisions. First it was a single core, but now they have added the multi-core CPU emulation support. It still has a little bit of revisions to go, but I think it has pretty decent implementation in this revision. So enable that is going to give you way better performance. It's going to use all of our CPU cores. Confirm exit while emulation is running. So if you want to get a prompt when you try to exit it, you can just select this, and when you try to exit it, it will prompt you, are you sure? Prompt for a user on game boot. So on Switch it prompts you for user when you boot a game. So if you want to do that too, if you want to do it here as well, then you can just check it. This option, pause emulation when in background. So when I minimize that, so it's going to pause the emulation. Hide mouse on inactivity, pretty self-explanatory. Hotkeys is just our hotkeys, and in UI we can change the settings, change the theme or whatever we might have. We can just change the look of this emulator. And then we have debug. It's not really that useful, it's only for debugging purposes. And in web section, we're gonna have our token. So our token is actually a validation ticket that we get for early access builds. So let's say you do sign up for Patreon, you're gonna get a specific token that you can paste in the web section to get your early access build. So it will let Yuzu know that you were a Patreon. Public release won't have a token, so they can't really paste it, but if you want to get that early access build, you can just paste a token, and you're only gonna get a token if you're a Patreon supporter. Okay, let's go down to system. Then you have language. Here are custom clock. If you want to use a custom clock, that's totally up to you. Pretty self-explanatory. Then we have profiles. This is my profile. This is a user, current user, Yuzu. So this is our emulator user. And then BCAT backend, I always have it enabled. So what is BCAT? BCAT is actually Nintendo's online services for Switch. And then Yuzu have their own implementation known as BoxCat. I won't recommend enabling this because it's still in very early stages of development, and I heard that Yuzu was a little bit concerned regarding Nintendo's claim, so they might file a claim or something like that. So don't enable that. First reason is because it's not that developed yet, and second reason is because it's not developed yet, it's gonna take a it's gonna increase your workload and it might degrade your performance. So just enable it to none, and then you have our file system, our directories. In our CPU section, we have accurate, and you're only gonna select accurate if you have a really high-end PC. But I think even in those cases, you're gonna have to select unsafe. But if you have a really high-end PC, select accurate and go with that if it works. But if it doesn't, then we have to select unsafe. So when we select unsafe, we have access to our 3 options, and then we can use these 3 options to optimize our games. So first option is unfused FMA, improve performance on CPUs without FMA. So FMA is an instruction set like SSE, SSE2, SSE3, AVX, AVX2. So instruction set is like CPU's power tool that it can use to improve performance or improve efficiency in certain workloads. Not all of them, but in certain workloads. Not every CPU has FMA. Older AMD CPUs have FMA, but if you're using Intel or any other CPU, it's not going to have FMA, so it's definitely a good idea to enable that. I think that as Nintendo Switch has FMA instruction set, so keep this enabled no matter what. So unfused FMA. But if you have an older AMD CPU, just do a Google search for your CPU number and then find out what instruction set does it support. And if it does support FMA, then you can disable that, but only in that scenario. Other than that, you will always have it enabled. Then we have faster FRS QRTE and FRECPE. So this is also a really good option. So it is floating point reciprocal estimate and then floating reciprocal square root estimation. So it's gonna optimize our calculation and give us better performance. So just check that, make sure that it's enabled, and it also has a very good implementation. These are actually assembly language features, so we're gonna leave it enabled. Then we have inaccurate NAND handling. Only this one out of these three is a little bit problematic in some cases. So when you're running your titles, make sure that you're on unsafe and tick these three options. But these are experimental, and especially this third one. So if you get some accuracy errors, just disable that, enable these two, and then see how your game runs. So first try to run it with these three enabled, but if it doesn't run that accurately, then disable that, try to run it with this, and hopefully it should work fine. So that's our CPU feature and our unsafe, and we have enabled debug mode, which we're not going to go into because it's only for debugging purposes. It's not really that performance related. Debug is our debugging purposes, for debugging purposes, and we're not going to even touch that. And then in graphics, we have our API. We have OpenGL and Vulkan. OpenGL is more accurate than Vulkan, and then Vulkan is faster than OpenGL. So that's your takeaway right there. So OpenGL is more accurate, Vulkan is faster. Now I'm gonna explain where you would use OpenGL and where you would use Vulkan. So you would always want to use Vulkan. I think Vulkan's been long enough, especially in this emulator, that it has a pretty good implementation. So always try to use Vulkan. In some older CPUs or GPUs, in some older PCs, you're not going to have this enabled. You're not going to have access to Vulkan because your PC doesn't support Vulkan. But if it does, it's probably the faster option. So go with Vulkan. And one thing I'd like to mention is Vulkan has a bad reputation for being less accurate, but I don't think that's the case because Vulkan has really good implementation these days, just as much as OpenGL. It only has a bad reputation because it doesn't support legacy devices while OpenGL does. So that's why it has a little bit of a bad reputation, but I think it's just as fast or just as accurate as OpenGL, and newer emulator are using this Vulkan technology to emulate their games more efficiently. Then we have used disk shader cache. So whatever shaders we're storing on our disk drive, it's going to use that. Then we have used asynchronous GPU emulation. Always enable that with Vulkan. So remember, Vulkan and this option is going to play really nice with each other. So enable that if you're using Vulkan, and then use NVDEC emulation. So this is a codec and especially useful with NVIDIA GPUs. Enable that. It's gonna let you render your cutscenes and some of your scenes a little bit more efficiently. So might give you a little bit performance boost if you're using Vulkan. And then we have our default force, stretch to window, whatever aspect ratio you want. And then let's go to advanced. So accuracy level is high, and if you're on a high-end PC, you might want to get high accuracy level. But if you're on a low-end or mid-end PC, just select normal. So there's no point of selecting high if you're on a low or mid-end PC. But if you're on a high-end PC, select high. Never select extreme, please, never. It's only for debugging purposes, I'm telling you, because it's gonna trigger everything and gonna try to give you the best accuracy, which means insane workload even for high-end PC. So just go with high on high-end and normal on low-end or mid-end PCs. Use VSync OpenGL only. So if you have a OpenGL enabled, you can use VSync. I never use VSync, as I've told you guys before, because it's not worth it. It takes a toll on your performance. VSync is for screen tearing effects. So if you have a high-end PC and you have a screen tearing effects, you can enable that to get rid of those effects. Use assembly shaders experimental NVIDIA OpenGL only. So you can use assembly shaders which are a little bit more native, and as a result a little bit faster. So that's why it's only an experimental feature, and you would only enable that in specific scenarios. So if you have an NVIDIA GPU and you're using OpenGL, and maybe perhaps you're on a low-end spectrum, just try to enable that. But it's only experimental feature, so disable that and then try to run your game before and after enabling this option and see what difference does it make. And use asynchronous shader building. It's a really good option. We're gonna enable that because we're using Vulkan in here. So Vulkan and asynchronous shader building are really good options. Use fast GPU time, leave it enabled regardless of your renderer, regardless of your API, leave it enabled. And then we have anti-scope ring filtering, which is gonna be I always leave it to 2x. I know some people go crazy at 8x or 16x. All it's gonna do is increase your workload. So, and just the artificialness of that filtering doesn't look that good to me. It just doesn't look that natural. So I think 2x is the sweet spot. It's gonna give you minimum workload while also improving your scenes. Okay, so that was our Vulkan. Let's talk about OpenGL for a second. So for OpenGL, we will always leave it enabled, but these two are experimental with OpenGL. So leave it enabled, but also try to run your game before and after enabling these options and see what effect does it make. But I think, in my opinion, it's these are experimental with OpenGL, but with Vulkan it's a given. And then select this one as well. It's experimental, but it can improve your performance when you're using OpenGL, and enable that. But I have a feeling that it might cause some problems. So if it does, just try disabling that and then try running your title or game. Okay, so that covers our graphics section. Then we have audio section, then we have output engine, which is auto, and then we have QBEB. Honestly, I haven't heard of QBEB. I think it might be some customized rendering engine that Yuzu developer team might have made. I've only heard of XA audio and direct sound, so it's quite new to me. So we're just gonna leave it to auto. It's not a big deal. Enable audio stretching, definitely enable that, and then audio device auto, or you can use speakers, headphone, whatever you want. Here's our volume slider. And in controls you can have specific profiles and specific functions. If you want, you can have different profiles, totally up to you. So that covers our configuration settings. Now we're going to go into some in-game settings. So this is a directory, by the way. If you want to add a new directory, if you want to remove that, open directory, and then always enable scan subfolders, because if you have the game in some subdirectory, so for example, I have a folder within this folder, then a folder within that folder, we want to scan all those folders. So scan subfolders, yeah. Open directory location is going to open that. And so these are two games. It shows our compatibility, file type, and then size. So let's see here. Open save data. If you want to see where your save data is located, you can use that. And if you've installed a specific mod for this game, you can also check out the location, transferable shader cache. If you want to transfer your shader cache to maybe your other PC. So for example, you have two PCs and you already played the hell out of this game on this PC, and you have a quite large shader bank, you might want to transfer it to other PC. Remove, if you want to remove any of these things. Dump room FS, so if you want to dump some specific content from this game, you can use the room FS Copy title, ID, clipboard, all these are pretty self-explanatory. Now let's go to properties. Add-ons, it's gonna tell you what add-ons are actually there. Bypass boot crash. So in early revisions of Yuzu, this game would just crash. When this game first came out, it would just crash on the boot screen. Thanks to our beautiful modding community and our developers community, they actually gave us a patch, and then you can just use this patch to bypass that crash. Now I don't think in the latest revision it's a problem, so you can just disable that. But I have it enabled. Actually, to be honest with you, I haven't played this game in such a long time. I was really excited when it came out, but haven't played it because Yuzu was going through its revisions, and it wasn't really that playful. And now playable. Now I don't get that much time. Anyways, that's our update 1.1.4. Again, in the previous revisions, there was an error where it wouldn't launch the game if it wasn't 1.14. And then we have the same settings that we went through, but these in here, you have your global settings, and these are your local settings. So you might want to set your global settings, and it will be applied to every single game. But if you have different games, and keep that in mind, every single game requires different settings. So you have to actually experiment with these settings to see which settings work the best. Unfortunately, I can't give you the best settings for every single situation, every single scenario, every single revision, every single game, because every PC is different, and the fundamental ways they communicate with each other aren't that different, but their drivers, their coding, their instruction sets, their emulation preference are completely different. That's why it's always a really good idea to experiment with the different settings. Then we have our graphics, our advanced graphics, and our audio. Yep, that's it. So there we have it, guys. That basically covers Yuzu in detail. Hopefully I've covered everything. Now I'm just gonna tell you the settings that I would use in low-end or mid-end PCs. So if you just go into configure and then limit CPU percent, so I'll just set it to 100%. Yep, multi-core CPU emulation. These aren't really that performance oriented. So I would use unsafe. I will enable these three, and if I get a problem, I would just try disabling this. But if the problem doesn't go away, then I would maybe disable this. So I will try to bunch different settings together, but in my experience these two settings really work nice with each other. And then in graphics I will use Vulkan. Yep, that's great. High, normal, and then use asynchronous, and that's it. I'll press OK. So that was your recommended specification for low end and mid end. Now let's talk high end. What would you do in high end? So funny thing is, you would still use Vulkan high end. So CPU, first try accurate on high end. It's not a guarantee, but it could work if you have a really high-end PC. And we're talking RTX 20 series or even 30 series of cards. So try accurate. I highly doubt that it will work, but if it does, then that's amazing. We're just gonna go with unsafe. Enable all these three settings. And in graphics, we're just gonna use Vulkan. Keep in mind that in some games you might have to select OpenGL just because of it's a little bit more accurate. So in some cases, if you've tried all those settings and nothing is working out, it might be this one might be worth trying. So first we have Vulkan. Use this shader and then advanced we have high, because we want high priority. You can also use VSync just to give you a little bit more accurate performance. And then you can disable that, but only if your GPU is really fast. But just leave it enabled. And if your CPU is being bottlenecked by this option, if your GPU is being bottlenecked by this option, then disable that. So we're just gonna keep it enabled, and that's it. So there you have it, guys. That was Yuzu Emulator for you. Now they are constantly adding new features, new implementations, new revisions. I will make an update video if I find that a feature that was well refined, if a feature has been well refined, or if they've added a new feature that improves performance drastically. Because my main point, I guess you could say my main aim of making these emulator guides is to help those with low-end PCs, because high-end PC you can just go with the default settings and it could work fine, I think. But for low-end and mid-end PCs, you really have to get into the nitty-gritty and see how everything works with every other option. So hopefully you guys found this helpful. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. Catch you guys later.